6 months after Bridgerton season 3, I think it is unquestionable that it remains one of the hottest intellectual properties and part of the pop culture zeitgeist. If you have seen my face before, it is highly likely that it is through an exploration, an analysis, a celebration of Bridgerton. But if you have seen my face before, it is also likely that you know that not only am I a historical romance reader, but Bridgerton helped welcome me in to the genre, like so many, only much earlier, in that I read it when I was in high school. And while I was introduced to the series as it was wrapping up, I still remember reading about Gregory running down the streets of London in On the Way to the Wedding for the first time. And so with this juggernaut of a property, there was a lot of celebration within the historical romance community and a lot of possibility that we saw within this catching on and sparking interest so acutely. The opportunity not only to adapt more historical romance in a way that we really hadn't seen from a historical romance series prior to Bridgerton, which I talk about quite a lot, but also for a revitalization of a genre that is constantly growing and revitalizing itself and welcoming new voices into that genre, and more importantly, new readers into that genre as well. And this has coincided with a renewed interest in reading and especially romance more generally, as Bridgerton initially released in 2020, and over 2020 and 2021 we really saw the rise of especially booktok and a revitalization of literary landscapes. And so it's been interesting in wake of all of this and the renewed interest to see the romance market, which is unquestionably cyclical, moving away from established romance readers, established historical romance readers more specifically, I should say. And while I have kind of been observing this in bits and pieces on my channel for years, really even tracing back to the introduction of the Mass Max format, which did not take on, and the subsequent demise of the mass market that we saw in wake of that, and how that really has, I think, impacted the historical romance genre most acutely, as it has the most established mass market readership and the most entrenched readership that is used to certain conventions and price points, which we will touch on further. But in wake of this, there were times I felt like I was maybe being somewhat hyperbolic. And of course, surely there are times I was being somewhat hyperbolic, but as someone who has been reading in romance for essentially 2 decades now and was brought into the genre through historical romance, it has been very interesting to almost feel sidelined as a reader within a genre that I came up in and hold so dear. While I consider myself well-read, especially within my friend groups, there are people with really awe-inspiring knowledge of the genre and the history of the genre, not all of which we are going to dive into here. This is going to be a lot more anecdotal. But what exactly are we diving into here? So I have been kind of lamenting the waning of historical romance over the last 2 to 3 years minimum, and I felt kind of isolated in that. But recently I'd been seeing a lot of threads popping up that were kind of alluding to larger discussions within the industry related to historical romance and established historical romance authors perhaps being guided away from writing in historical romance based on the market. And I put out a thread asking to be pointed to some sources related to this for the potential of maybe having a conversation here, because I even mentioned it in my Goodreads reaction video that maybe this is a larger discussion. It's a discussion I've been kind of dancing around and indulging in other videos and other conversations for years now. But I was not expecting a response to the extent that I got a response. At the time, I had barely under 100 Threads followers. At the time now, I have barely over 100 Threads followers. So I'm not, a presence on the platform. And I generally shy away from capital D discourse to the point where I texted my friend in Romance Book Club and I was like, I think I accidentally started some discourse. And she's like, I saw. And I was like, Oh no, but I haven't been centered in this discourse, and it was never my intention to be centered in this discourse. Rather, I think this question tapped into a lot of feelings that authors and readers are currently having around the market and how historical romance is positioned within said market that people want to talk about. And so I think that it is important to discuss and to analyze to whatever breadth. And so I thought it would be important and beneficial to bring some of that discussion here. But to know where the discussion is now, let's first do a brief flashback to some of the discussions leading up to this moment on just this channel. So I have seen a lot of shift recently, which is great, in indies especially stocking romance. But as I have said before, a lot of this comes in the trade paperback size, and when there are mass markets, I personally generally feel like it's a slimmer selection for me as a reader. Generally, a lot of those books that I see in stores I have read, and I actually was very shocked that I didn't see more stores pulling in, especially more historical romance after the Bridgerton boom. For me, even when there are recommendations of, if you liked Bridgerton, read this next, and to not see mass markets, it always kind of throws me. In the same way that pre-Bridgerton, a Julia Quinn blurb on a book meant something very different to me as a reader than it does now. It was still a get and still an indicator for me that, oh, this may be of interest. But at the time, I potentially would have aligned it more with the snappy dialogue or the themes that Julia Quinn likes to explore in her work, or the family structures or series structures that I see in her work. And now it's very much a kind of get for Bridgerton fans, and it feels a lot broader and looser, which is fine because I want people to discover books, but I'm having to interact with those blurbs in a different way. They used to be more of an indicator into what I thought I was getting into in the book. But anyway, all of that aside, I have been kind of shocked to not see more mass markets stocked, especially in independent bookstores, with the proven success of Bridgerton, and especially with the voraciousness of romance readers. And romance is undeniably on the rise, and we are definitely seeing independent bookstores stocking romance in a way that they have historically poo-pooed. But we're seeing a lot more, as I said, of these trade paperbacks, which isn't a bad thing, and as I've said before, are easier to return for independent bookstores. And I've seen stores, especially on social media, really talking up that they stock romance and being like, of course we stock romance. Why would we alienate that portion of the readership and that market because it's so big and voracious? And yet, all I'm seeing them talk about in terms of romances are these trade paperbacks. And as someone who's been reading in the genre for a long time, again, never claim to be an expert because I don't read widely enough and I don't remember well enough to ever consider myself an expert. But I've seen shifts, but there are still a lot of authors that are auto by authors for me. I'm talking my Sarah McLean, my Lisa Kleypas, my Alyssa Cole, Beverly Jenkins, Joanna Shoup, Eloisa James, Tessa Dare, these huge, huge romance names. Admittedly, mostly Avon. You can kind of tell where I live as a reader, but these are huge names. And even Julia Quinn, the Bridgerton prequels that were coming out right before the show premiered were mass market releases. And this is the format I came up in romance. And so we are definitely seeing a shift toward trade. We are seeing a lot of new romance readers get into the genre via trade romances, and that's great. But in some ways, it feels like we are leaving mass market readers behind. And I have been excited, like I said, to see these romance sections expand in bookstores. But like today, I was hoping to pick up like the rest of the Eloisa James Wallflowers series. I have the first one that I pre-ordered, which I shamefully haven't read yet, but I was hoping to pick up the rest of the series. Didn't see any Eloisa James today. I didn't see any Joanna Shoup. I saw like one-offs of Sarah McLean and Tessa Dare at Women and Children First on their mass market spinner. I remember when that spinner went in, I think I've talked to you about it here before, how excited I was to see that mass market spinner, and it is a very sad spinner. It is very rarely replenished. I did manage to find a new title on it today, and I did buy that title because I did want to, and I have been trying very consciously to spend my money on mass markets if I'm interested in them and I see them. So there is that buying history, there is that purchasing power, but so often those titles are not new. They're backlist, they're things I've already read. And as a romance reader, even though I never feel as voracious as others or as I could be or should be, I've read those. And I'm not saying don't carry backlist, because I absolutely would have picked up some Lisa Kleypas backlist today because I'm working through some of that backlist when I can, because, well, well, mostly because there's no new book this year, or at least that I've seen. However, a lot of these books are like one-offs in series. Even the one I bought today is a one-off from a series, and it's the end of a series, I believe, and I haven't read any of the others, which I will be fine. I will manage, and I will tell you about that book. But I was just kind of bummed, especially because the titles you're most frequently going to see in mass market are historical romances, and I very much gravitate toward historical romances. I'm not saying historical romances only exist in mass market. I'm gonna be a little blunt and honest in this moment. I'm still a little conflicted on it, and I feel bad because it's such a beautiful space. It's such a fun space. It's so welcoming of its customers. I love the owner, but yet again, and again, it was slightly picked over. I did see some Beverly Jenkins. I did see some Adriana Herrera, and we know how I feel about Adriana Herrera in that I love her. But there really wasn't a historical section. There was no historical section, period. And they do have the store organized by like romance subgenres. And for me, historicals are what got me into romance. I love historicals. My romance book club all gravitate toward historicals. Emily is nodding in the front seat since you can't see her, so someone is agreeing with me in this moment. And they have like a couple, like I said, sprinkled throughout, but they don't have historicals. They have in the past, but it was all books that me and other friends, and I'm not taking all the credit here, I just know that I personally submitted some, recommended via Instagram when they asked for recommendations on books to stock, and it doesn't seem like they're getting restocked. And to be fair, I don't know if they're selling. I know I bought some because I want to prove that they sell. But I don't know, it's something I've been grappling with, and I think that if you watch the channel regularly, you've probably seen me grappling with this over the years, kind of knowing that historical romances are what have gotten me into romance, and I feel like are having, or should be having, a big cultural moment, especially with Bridgerton, and then going to bookstores that have expanded their romance offerings and then just not seeing options there. So I don't know, I'm gonna stop complaining. I went to Barnes & Noble for the first time in probably years, and though I have been kind of bemoaning the demise of the mass market romance on my YouTube channel, it was honestly kind of devastating to not see a single historical mass market romance. Which also brings me back to my sadness over the death of the mass market, which, you know, wouldn't have helped me in terms of packing light, but I did overhear someone at the Love Sweet Arrow table talking about the mass markets they had out, which were noticeably less than last year, which was kind of sad, mostly Beverly Jenkins. And this young woman said something like, oh, these look like what my grandma would read. So moving on to romance, where I will inevitably be disappointed by the lack of historical. I don't know. And so clearly this has been something on my mind. I've been noticing anecdotally the shift in the market in terms of what bookstores are carrying, even as there is a greater romance presence in especially independent bookstores than I personally have ever seen, and also reader perception of a lot of things. Now, that being said, like for anything we are going to dive into today, that is not across the board. For instance, Second Flight Books in Lafayette, Indiana has not only a really established romance presence of recent titles, but they also have a really robust used section of mass markets and especially historicals, in the sense that that's what I was personally looking for when I visited the store, and so that is what I noticed. So I'm not drawing a broad brush here in the sense of removing all nuance, but just kind of trying to look at the general kind of state of things. And I think another piece of this within context that I can kind of frame somewhat differently now, but also still acknowledge the framing I had when I first saw this news, in that Sarah MacLean, one of the most established current historical romance voices and a very established voice within the romance community as well, with her podcast Fated Mates that she co-hosts with Jen Prokop, and a real champion of the romance genre. She's currently one book away from the finale of her current historical series, Hell's Bells, which I highly encourage you to read. I think a lot of them, if not all of them, that are currently published are currently on Kindle Unlimited, if that is an option for you. But she announced last year that she was going to be taking a break before releasing the last book, Duchess's book, a highly anticipated book, especially if you know how Sarah MacLean structures her series, and there's usually something that we've been waiting for at the end, and some kind of grand reveal that has been teased, and teased we definitely are. But she revealed that that was going to be put on hold as she was writing a contemporary. And at the time, that didn't necessarily concern me so much outside of the weight. And to a certain extent, I definitely think that this framework is still important to this particular piece of the puzzle, in that it is clear through both Hell's Bells and her discussions on fated mates, and I'm not up to all of the episodes, but the ones I have listened to, that this is an interest area of hers and a direction I could see her interested in playing in. And additionally, as someone who has been reading romance for a long time, it takes me back to Amanda Quick, aka Jane Ann Krentz, aka Jane Castle, a little bit as well, in that Jane Ann Krentz, who writes contemporary romances, romantic suspense most specifically, and she also writes historical romance under Amanda Quick, and also futuristic sci-fi romance under Jane Castle, which I have not read to the extent that I've read her other pen names. And when I was in high school, she was actually releasing books across the pen names within the same world, if you've heard me talk about the Arcane Society series before. And so the move across romantic subgenres, even for authors who are well known within their specific subgenre, is not concerning to me, because of course authors have different interests and different muscles as a writer they may want to flex, or different worlds they want to explore. And so that on its face was not necessarily concerning, but with some of the added context of the last year, it does frame it in a slightly different light, though of course there is the opportunity for multiple things to be true at once. And some of those things are, I went recently, I believe I snuck a video in, to a newer Barnes & Noble within Chicago at Webster Place, or essentially what is replacing the Webster Place Barnes & Noble. And while this is admittedly a smaller footprint Barnes & Noble than it had previously occupied, and I have not yet been to the Wicker Park Barnes & Noble that they opened, that I believe is now the stand-in flagship or biggest Barnes & Noble within the city proper, after a lack of chain presence for many years, which is a completely different conversation. But the romance section of this particular Barnes & Noble was very different than the romance section of Barnes & Nobles I knew in the city before the previous locations had closed. And the romance section was basically taken over by trade paperback, and with that there was less historical romance represented, because while a lot of historical romance is being released in trade paperback, there's a lot of backlist and a lot of authors that exist and are known in mass market then that are giants of the genre. Beverly Jenkins, Sarah MacLean, Lisa Kleypas, Tessa Dare, I would argue from my own personal preferences recently, Diana Quincy. These authors didn't have a presence within a genre that I consider them giants in. And with this, authors like Julia Quinn, who do have a presence, their backlist isn't necessarily as represented as simply the Bridgerton series, and if we're lucky, the Bridgerton prequels. And when I asked about this at the cash wrap, and I was a little hesitant to do this, but I was honestly really bummed. It was a moment, one of the things that I have always found redeeming of Barnes & Noble when we talk about it in relation to the indie bookstore market, is that they have had historically this presence of mass market romances, of harlequins. And I walked into a store that was completely ignoring this readership, and as a reader I felt ignored and unseen in a genre, like I said, that I have been reading in for decades. And we will circle back to some of that, but there was an emotional response, I'm not gonna lie about that. And so I asked very politely, because I have worked retail, and more importantly, I've worked retail in a bookstore. And the response I got was one that a lot of the Barnes & Nobles do have the mass markets, that this particular location just doesn't because of the size. But then there was a comment about how most of the mass markets are harlequins anyway, which felt a little dismissive to harlequins, admittedly. And while I am not as robust a reader in harlequins, because the pacing works and doesn't work for me sometimes, depending, one, that felt a little odd, because I could see harlequins across the genre categorizations really appealing to readers who get into romance through Kindle Unlimited because of that fast pacing. And it alluded to a kind of perception of romance, and particularly historical romance and mass market romance, that we will dig into a little deeper here in a second. But also, I made the point as an avid Avon romance reader that that's not true, that there are other mass market romances that exist, and I kind of left it at that. But it very much made me aware of some of the current perceptions. And on the heels of this, a month maybe later, I started to see rumblings on Threads about people, authors being kind of guided by their agents and, more importantly, their publishers to move away from historical romance. But I wasn't seeing, like I said earlier, the kind of genesis of this. So I posed the question, and I got responses I never fully anticipated, including from authors like Harper St. George, which you may remember from my books to read after the Buccaneers book recommendation video for her Gilded Age romances that, according to her, have earned out for her publisher. She is an established name in the genre, as many of the people that responded to this were and are, and yet they are being guided away from historical romance in the current market. And that is going to be a very, very important piece of this. Again, going back to the cyclical nature of things. And yet it's also something that feels unprecedented, because we are at a moment, one, where historical romance has been entrenched for so long, but two, we are kind of at a crossroads in terms of mass markets waning along with everything else, the price of ebooks moving to trade for romance. There are a lot of factors that we will touch on, and I realize just in the introduction that this is already a much longer video and there is a lot to dig into here. So thank you for being interested in this conversation, and please bear with me. I will do my best to get through this as succinctly as possible, but I, of course, very much am interested in your thoughts and engagement. So please feel free to chime into the conversation below, and please know I am not talking about absolutes through any of this, nor am I saying this subgenre is dying. And there are very much still agents and publishers that are taking on historical romance and new historical romance authors debuting, as we saw in 2024. But in some of these responses, primarily from authors that I was getting, I was definitely peeking into their publisher. And a common denominator across multiple authors I was seeing was Berkeley. And coming on the heels of seeing many readers on Threads in particular celebrating their inclusion in the Berkeley Influencer Program, consider this me blowing any chance of future involvement with the Berkeley Influencer Program, which honestly is probably fine. While I am very, very happy for the people that have gotten and are very excited to be involved in the program, it's also kind of giving me, while I wasn't around to see it, I was around for the Smoky Glow recaps of the Anastasia Beverly Hills PR list and influencers working to get on that PR list back in the day, and it's feeling very much that. This FOMO marketing and PR that could be used, I would argue, to champion and back some of these historical titles that they could be publishing, to generate interest in titles and helping their list meet the readership that exists. However, it feels like a lot of it goes back to perception. In this kind of anecdotal observation, it feels like Berkeley is trying to attract the young, hip, broader audiences of TikTok, while historicals are being perceived as grandma books. And this feels like really loaded language, right? Because it is, in the sense that it is implying some kind of judgment toward books that older women read, which we will circle back to. And as a 34-year-old who is a long-established historical romance reader, I do not consider myself a grandma, and my grandma personally read Amish romances, but that's another conversation. However, I did see this sentiment echoed in at least one reply to my thread That feels weird to say. I miss saying tweet. Why did we have to ruin it? And this was alluded to in the context of industry conversations. However, I have noticed this as well. Before I was in my feelings about Barnes& Noble not carrying mass market romance, I was in my feelings at Printers Row in Chicago 2024, where I was at the Love Sweet Arrow table. And Love Sweet Arrow has historically always had such a vibrant selection across subgenres of romance, including historical romance, which they still did, but I noticed a significant lessening of the mass market presence at the table this year. And based on my kind of interaction with this particular romance bookstore, it means to me that they are following market trends, because I know that they read historical romance and they obviously still had a lot of it out. However, while I was shopping the table, I overheard a girl with her boyfriend who was probably early 20s, mid 20s. I'm bad at ages, but make an offhand comment, either her or her boyfriend, I don't remember now, about them being mass markets that I was currently looking at, being books like her grandma read. And it wasn't meant with any judgment, I don't think. And I tried not to read any judgment into it, especially within the context of a genre that is often maligned by broader readership and those outside of any kind of reader circles, to be completely honest. But it also struck me that this may be the perception of newer readers of a genre that I find so vibrant, and it really kind of starkly illustrated the contrast potentially between newer romance readers and established romance readers. And this, again, is not across the board, because a lot of people and readers coming into historical romance for the first time are attracted to some of those quintessential clinch covers and old illustrations. But we are seeing a lot of historical romance repackaged into the flatter illustration cartoon covers that are more broadly appealing for the genre right now. And we've talked about this a lot over the years in many contexts. I understand the move to trade in the sense of them being easier to return and easier to stock than in indie bookstores. And we will talk a little bit more about the logistics of that and mass market versus trade in a little bit. But in terms of the packaging and the perception, and even the repackaging is not particularly egregious. Romance and historical romance has been repackaged many times over throughout the years in terms of meeting with modern conventions and meeting modern readership where it is. If you have not listened to the Fated Mates episode on kind of the history of romance covers, it's one of my favorite episodes. And we have seen artwork on these covers, just the nature of the artwork has changed over the years. And while the clinches used to be on the cover proper, we have seen them migrate over the years. When I started reading romance, they were often not in the step back, they were sometimes in the step back, but sometimes they were on the back of the book, to the point where when I was in high school, I actually sewed a bunch of knockoff Vera Bradley book covers, mass market covers, that I designed the pattern for myself, and that is the last time I've ever patterned anything. But I designed those specifically so that I could no longer tape an index card to the back of my romance that I was in the middle of and wanted to read before class, because I was that nerd that took any moment I could before a class started to read a book. And one day in my geometry class freshman year, in which I was in a class with a lot of upperclassmen in a very small school where everyone knew everyone, attention was drawn to the book I was reading, and my math teacher asked me to take the index card off of the back of the book, and I was like, I don't think I'm gonna do that. And I didn't, and he didn't press it. But there is a lot to be said about that, and I know that many readers are insecure about reading those covers when they're so prominent in public, and I don't begrudge that by any means, because I want you to be comfortable. And yet there is this yearning for this old artwork style, the step backs, the old clinches, from people who are big fans of the genre, whether they be authors or readers. For instance, we've seen many pre-order campaigns feature step back or clinch cover artwork as a pre-order incentive. Most recently, notably, and you should absolutely do this pre-order, we have a beautiful clinch cover artwork incentive from Adriana Herrera for her upcoming novel, and the last in the Las Leonas historical series, A Tropical Rebel Gets the Duke. I am very much looking forward to that book, and we will circle back to Adriana Herrera in a little bit, but we see these incentives and these kind of hallmarks of the genre for established readers. And so there is this attempt to bridge kind of new readership and old readership and all of the iterations that historical romance has had and will continue to have. And even amidst this attempt to bring a new readership, though I would argue, I don't know how hard we're really trying with historical romance to bring in new readership, and we will circle back to that in relation to an excellent thread series that Adriana Herrera did in kind of response to a lot of this conversation that I definitely want or would encourage you to check out and we will look at here. But there is still purchasing power for established romance readers and the older romance readers and older readers. While that purchasing power is being diminished by the change in normal price of books, that's another story. For instance, we have a whole new generation of romance readers who are being trained to expect $15 to $17 trade paperbacks as the price for a romance, while we have a whole generation before who expected mass market prices, especially for how voraciously romance is consumed by romance readers. But as a sidebar, it's also interesting in conversation of the cyclical nature of things in relation to, in this case, contemporary. We had a lot of discussion related to Emily Henry moving from being published first in trade paperback into hardcover and what that was. And as a long-term romance reader, to kind of throw it back again to Jane Ann Krentz and Amanda Quick as my, most top of mind example, I was used to both of those pen names coming out in hardcover first for, I think, even much speedier reads than I would expect from an Emily Henry. And so in some ways, an extremely popular author in the genre being moved to hardcover was less or is less egregious to me than the move to primarily trade as the price point, especially when looking at it in comparison to ebook prices that are supposed to be less than the trade paperback or less than the paperback, but are still equitable or more sometimes than the mass market would have been, and just how expensive titles are, which then incentivizes for knowledgeable romance readers waiting and not buying that title right away because inevitably, hopefully, in the current market, in 6 months to a year, it will go on sale in the ebook format. But there's also this duality in the perception of historical romance of historicals not being progressive enough, combined with this perception or this idea that current readers don't want to learn, and that historical romance involves the centering of history, which I mean it does, and I loved the Theodore Roosevelt cameo in one of the more recent Joanna Shoup books, but you don't have to intimately know the history of Theodore Roosevelt and how he was a very canonically correct Theodore Roosevelt or early Theodore Roosevelt to appreciate said cameo, and we will return to Joanna Shoup. And I do think a lot of this perception is aligned with a lot of the anti-booktok discourse that seems to be centering the loudest voices on booktok that are often also the most ignorant. And I'm trying not to say that as judgmental, but there is a certain contingent of loud voices that seem to be advocating for first-person, thinly drawn, self-insert narratives. But that is also by and far not my personal experience on the platform, and I think to allow these voices to drown out other voices is a disservice to readers and also shows a certain level of media illiteracy and lack of foresight and forethought in relation to the market, which we will also circle back to. But in relation to the perception of historicals, I do think that if we are looking at this through the context or the lens of new readers being invited into this world through things like Bridgerton, there is going to be a certain level of disappointment in relation to going back to those books that were written in the 90s and 2000s and are very much a product of the romance at that time. As we discuss on this channel, romance is written for the time it is written in, not the time it is written about even within the context of historicals. And many readers are going back to these books and are rightfully shocked by the lack of diversity in the books in relation to what they are seeing on their television screen. Then, in relation to the dichotomy of this, and as illustration, we have things like the most recent season of Bridgerton and after the most recent season of Bridgerton, where a change to the text was made in the introduction of Michaela instead of Michael, and even Julia Quinn was fighting off a lot of criticism for defending and championing that change to the text. And while there is a lot of discourse related to that specific change, I also remember a lot of the criticism she was pushing back against in relation to Regé-Jean Page's casting in season 1. And so while I am a champion and a lover of historical romance, I also still recognize its weaknesses. For instance, of course, in some of the older titles, having to read them through a particular lens, and some things today not holding up as well. But also in this current environment, especially right now, of these discussions of reading being political, which to me is such an obvious statement to the point of being inane, but it's also impossible to not recognize certain parts of the historical romance readership, going back to even, I've talked about how Sarah MacLean and her entry into the romance scene was kind of a watershed moment for my relationship with historical romance, and it just kind of revitalizing the genre for me personally as a reader. But I remember even back in the early 2010s, reading reviews of her books and people being upset with the representation they saw, upset with the characters, and essentially complaining that her books were too progressive and hiding behind this idea of historical accuracy, which I would argue is usually used as a kind of smokescreen and a way to uphold a white and myopic fantasy land in relation to historical romance. But for me, the authors that I gravitate to in historical romance reflect my ideals. And I think that a lot of this is coming to a head right now, as much is in the current discourse. But we saw a TikTok from Joanna Shoup recently, which I will include here.
So I sent out a newsletter last weekend that got quite a shockingly high number of very angry responses. As a Gilded Age historical author, I have spent years researching the mid to late 19th century, and I feel obligated to point out the parallels between what I see happening now versus what was happening then, because they're shockingly similar. And I can get into all the reasons why it's similar, from, the xenophobia, the racism, the rollback of reproductive rights, the concentration of wealth at the top. Listen, I almost feel like I could give a class on it. But my email was mostly about the rollback of reproductive rights. The angry emails I got in response basically said, how dare you? How dare you force your views onto me? So first of all, I dare. Let's just start there. I dare. Second of all, if you're reading my books, those are my political views. I don't hide them. That's writing. Those are my thoughts coming through as character and plot development and conflict. That actually comes from my brain. Those are my thoughts. Those are my views. I've written about the Comstock laws. I've written about reproductive rights in the 19th century. I've written about the Chinese Exclusionary Act. I've written about class conflict. I've written about the concentration of wealth at the top. I really can't do any more than I have to really tell you, without telling you, what my political views are. So let me just tell you, I'm horrified by the administration that has just been put in place. So writing is political, books are political. And you know what? If you're reading my books and you don't get that, I'm not sure I want you as a reader. You're not my audience. If you're reading historical romance to relive some sort of white nationalist patriarchy fantasy, because that's what you see in my books, wow, I am horrified. We are not simpatico, sister. I really didn't realize until I started getting these angry emails how many readers didn't get it. So how dare I? I dare. And I'm going to keep daring, because silence is acceptance. I don't accept what's happening. I will not be silenced. And if you want to withhold the threat of I will no longer buy your books, Joanna Shoup, fine. Don't buy them. They're not for you. Okay? So I dare. Yes, I dare. And I'm going to keep daring.
But Joanna Shoup's politics have always been so clear to me in her books and are part of what I respond to, even going back to her accurate portrayal of Theodore Roosevelt. And in her most recent book, I believe it's still her most recent, she is exploring the Comstock laws. Like, there is a real engaging with real history through the promise of the happily ever after. So my point is to say that yes, there is a certain contingent of historical romance readers that enjoy this genre because it allows them to play within a very small version of the past. And I think a lot of the perception and judgment of historical romance can be traced back to some of those ideas and perceptions. However, within historical romance of the current moment, we've been seeing the genre opening up in new and exciting ways in terms of diversity of both perspective and even place and time, because we have been very pigeonholed into Regency as the kind of definition of historical romance, which is not the case. And part of why I have responded so much to authors like Adriana Herrera coming out with the Las Leonas series, and heck, even Beverly Jenkins, partly because she's Beverly Jenkins, can make me care about a Western. I historically do not like Westerns, but give me a Beverly Jenkins historical Western romance, that's another story. And so while we're on the precipice with this genre and it feels so ripe to open right up in terms of perspective and readership, it feels like traditional publishing is just kind of throwing up its hands and giving up. But why is that? How is traditional publishing, who is being handed potential new readers through the fandom of Bridgerton, combined with established readers of historical romance, failing so hardly to market this subgenre to current readers? Now, I am not new to criticizing publishing's lack of innovation, and I talk about a lot of my critiques and the possibilities that exist in my video Adapt or Die, where I kind of analyze whether publishing adapts to reader behavior and reader wants and the market, or rather it tries to pigeonhole us into what it wants us to do. And in some ways, we could say that in the current moment, it is responding to demands from the likes of TikTok at a more expedient rate than we have ever seen before. But I think it is doing it in the worst possible way and with the worst possible instincts, which honestly shouldn't be much of a surprise. And this circles us back to Adriana Herrera's threads, but I do want to read through these because I think that this is such an insightful and succinct exploration of this very topic. So she says, I'm going to preface this thread by saying I am only talking about romance publishing because it's what I know. I understand the landscape of publishing has changed dramatically with the advent of TikTok, the expansion of the readership due to the pandemic, and the domination of indie publishing in the past few years. But what we're not going to do is suggest that historical is waning because pubs don't know what to do with it, as though traditional publishing is some kind of helpless bystander with no ability to strategize or create interest in a subgenre. The very implication that these houses don't have the capability of harnessing audiences is wild and borderline gaslighting. The truth is, for decades, Romance Pub relied on authors willing to write for next to nothing. And now that indie is essentially doing market testing and creating audiences for them, they don't even need to bother with a mid-list, take risks, or even take real chances on new voices. Because acquiring a diverse debut and dropping that book into the void is not investing in diversity. Historical is waning in no small part because of Trad's short-sightedness. Because even late-stage capitalism requires some strategy and foresight. Bridgerton, the show, was in works for years, and when it came out was a cultural juggernaut, and a perfect opening to bring new readers to the masters of the genre, Jenkins, Kleypas, MacLean, and many others. But did they even bother with a cover refresh, a marketing campaign, ads? No. Did they think there might be an interest in diverse historical, so let's acquire some books that will have characters like the actors in the show? No. It is true that publishing houses are businesses. It is also true that they are consistently unwilling to take any risks, and now they don't have to. Indie authors are creating markets and trends for themselves because Trad was not willing to take chances on anything that didn't already sell. And the moment the trends shift, I hope they don't do the same thing they did with all those digital first imprints they opened after 50 Shades blew up. The imprints, which, by the way, were the only entry points for BIPOC and LGBT authors who got no advance and no support. Scrap them and move on to the next thing. And this is absolutely what we are seeing. We're seeing this model of utilizing especially places like Kindle Unlimited as market research or a stand-in for the slush pile, which I know has derogatory connotations, but this idea that there is no championing, no developing of voices. But we see this down to even the structure and the storytelling of a lot of books and the way that voices are shifting without this editorial hand. And to a certain extent, that can also be a real gift in terms of moving the genre forward. But at the same time, as Herrera says, there's no championing of the mid-list. And the loss of the mid-list across the board in publishing is detrimental, period. And within romance, that has been where so many authors succeed and establish their names and have voracious readership even within that mid-list. And I think a lot of this circles back to, like I've alluded to the loss of the mass market format. It is abandoning readers who are used to a certain format and, more importantly, a certain price point, and they cannot sustain that in support of trade, and it is pushing them to find their books in different ways, whether that just be waiting for the sale. Of course, the library is still an option, but what does that look like, and even what does acquiring within libraries look like? Of course, the higher price of books and formats is going to impact library budgets as well, though I cannot speak to that with any expertise. But then also pushing people back into systems like Indie and KU in order to get their titles, which is where we're seeing a lot of shift right now and has been alluded to by Sarah MacLean herself in response to this very conversation in threads that I maybe accidentally helped start. And this speaks to the changing expectations of readers over the past couple of years, reinforced and expedited by the emphasis on self-publish and indie, and especially the KU ecosystem, where the algorithm drives visibility and requires a certain level of turnaround and activity from authors, requiring them to publish at ever-increasing rates, which means that iconic romance moments like "I have personally explained the process to you, Deborah" don't even really make sense within current contexts. Because if we look back to that response from Nora Roberts to a reader who was demanding books come out more than once a year and kind of outlining her view of the process, and Nora Roberts being like, that's not how it works. But now it's complicated by readers used to this very rapid release publishing schedule that is even making its way into traditional publishing, and whether that means cutting corners in editing, whether that be developmental edits, copy edits. As a reader, I would argue both, and have been frustrated by that, to be completely honest, even within the context of romance. And I do worry about authors burning out on both sides of the spectrum. Now, I do recognize that people work at different paces, different speeds. Some authors really relish the high turnaround. They have lots of stories to tell, and it really works for them. And I'm very happy for that and for them, and that they have that outlet. But at the same time, it creates this ecosystem in which everyone kind of has to work at that pace in order to have any visibility and to make any money. And also, I don't think that it's any more of a service to readers than it is to authors. While there is this kind of emphasis on more books for readers is always good, which I do think it is, and especially the potential with indie, like I mentioned before, to really play with perspective, to play with form, to give us new innovation within the genre, which I do think that indie and self-pub allows for much more expeditiously than traditional publishing. However, I do think that there is a limit to everything, in the sense that readers still only have so many hours of the day. While I have been kind of bemoaning the waning of historical romance and not having as many titles, there are still many titles, to the point where I feel somewhat hypocritical even mentioning it at times, because I have not read all of the titles I've been excited for, even in 2024, which is evidenced by my anticipated releases videos and what books I've gotten to and what books I haven't yet gotten to and are sitting in a pile or sitting on my Kobo and I'm ready to read. But there's still only so many reader hours in the day. And so do I want more? Absolutely yes. And we are getting more. Even within January, I started to map out books I'm excited for January in anticipation of doing an anticipated release video. And there are a number of historical romances on that list, including, to my kind of surprise, some repackaged Jude Deveraux, which I think is a fascinating inclusion in this conversation, because that is one of the OG historical names in terms of historical romance, back with like Julie Garwood, who I talked about last year in revisiting some of her books. And so to see that repackaged for a modern audience is interesting. And are we going to see the repackaging of the backlist in an attempt to gain some of this readership as well? And we are getting new names still. Like I said, there have been new people debuting in historical romance. And at the same time, I see some of these names that I love and have not seen them publish a historical for a second. Lisa Kleypas finished her last series a couple of years ago, and we have not gotten a new Lisa Kleypas since. I don't think that there's been a new historical Beverly Jenkins since her most recent series, at least to what I've seen. And potentially the most egregious to me personally, Diana Quincy started a new series, Sirens and Silk, a year or two ago. We read the first one in my March Madness mass market romance bracket thing, and it won. I loved that book so much, but there has not been a second book announced, and Diana Quincy is one of my favorite recent discoveries in historical romance, and so that is personally devastating. But at the same time, we have series like Las Leonas and the Luna Sisters finishing up next year. So there are all of these moving pieces, and like I said, nothing is cut and dry, nothing is absolute. The subgenre is by no means dying, but it is absolutely at a pressure point. And I think this goes back to a couple of other points too. One that I've seen people raise in relation to other subgenres within romance that have kind of waned at different times. Most notably, I think recently with its kind of revitalization with paranormal romance, which we have seen kind of repackaged, and it's different than fantasy romance or romantasy, but I think we see it creeping back in. And the very valid and accurate point, that when that wasn't as hot in traditional publishing, we saw it really thriving in self-pub and indie pub, and how that kept the genre and kept it moving forward. And we're likely to see that with historical romance. We also saw this with contemporary to a certain extent, and so like Sarah McLean says, and I also trust her because she knows the genre very well, and she knows the industry very well, it will continue to thrive in self-pub. But this is unquestionably going to change things for readers, especially in terms of discovery as well. It does bring me back to my teenage years, again, to come full circle a little bit, in relation to I worked in high school at my public library, which I've mentioned before. And this is actually where I discovered my love of romance. I had kind of tiptoed into the genre before, but it was really the women at the library who encouraged my love of romance and validated it for me. We talked about romance. They gave me romance to read. They introduced me to Jane Ann Krentz and Amanda Quick, and I really developed my love of the genre there. And I remember talking to my library director at one point. I think I was in my time travel romance phase, which I still am, and I would argue is a subgenre of historical romance. But I was kind of lamenting even then that there weren't any new time travel romances for me to read. I had read everything with the sticker I could find, and I asked why we weren't getting any new time travel romances in. And my director kind of alluded to the cyclical nature of publishing and how we saw things, especially in romance, come in and out of popularity and in and out of vogue. And I feel like this has been just kind of a destabilizing moment. Destabilizing feels like hyperbole. A lot feels like hyperbole. I promise I'm not trying to speak in hyperbole or absolutes. But I think because historical romance has had such a presence for so long, and even within the cultural consciousness and the zeitgeist interpretation or view of romance, it goes back to the bodice rippers and the clinch covers. And historical romance, even when it wasn't the main subgenre of romance, has always had such a strong presence and a strong devoted readership. And so it feels odd in the current moment where a historical romance is forefront in the cultural consciousness to see the genre that ignited this fervor fall backward in relation. And so I want to emphasize again, amidst all of the capital D discourse, that historical romance isn't dead, it isn't dying, it still has devoted and enthusiastic authors and fans. And if anything, this conversation on Threads has really uplifted those voices and celebrated this subgenre that we love. And I don't want this to feel like a moment of discouragement. It's a moment of change, and things are definitely different, but things change all of the time, and we have the moment for this to be a transformative moment. Am I disappointed, discouraged that traditional publishing is not meeting this moment and is not giving readers and meeting readers where they are? Absolutely. And I think there are a lot of factors at play there as well in terms of the structure of these big organizations and the maximizing of profits and the burnout of a largely underpaid workforce that is kind of exploited for the passion of the thing, like so many arts adjacent institutions are. I think there are so many moving pieces. Again, to kind of reiterate, it's a little bit of that. It's a little bit of the toss-up of the mass market currently. And again, I don't think Mass Max was ever given an actual shot, especially as it was debuted amidst the pandemic. Most people just saw a price point. They didn't recognize that it was a different format of Mass Max. It was like $1 more. Then they got rid of the Mass Max and kept the mass market at the dollar higher price. And there were just so many pieces of that that didn't feel fully realized. And I think that this moment is illustrating that publishing kind of wants to be handed the answer by readers rather than innovating and meeting readers where they are and seeing the vision for readers, which is discouraging, but it doesn't mean that that vision isn't going to be realized. And when I first sent this initial thread out into the void, it really felt like kind of putting it out into the void. I have been kind of sitting on these thoughts and this exploration for honestly years now at this point, and I felt pieces starting to come together in these kind of whispers, but I never anticipated my thread being actually seen by people, and that's probably on me. I'm used to kind of flying under the radar on social media and not really appreciating how algorithms work, or that this was going to kind of cut through the moment and speak to what a lot of people are feeling. And in some ways, like I mentioned before, it has made me feel like part of a community. And, there are strengths and weaknesses of every community, and we're just kind of having to assess, but we have the opportunity to continue to support historical romance authors of all types, whether they be traditionally published, self-published, indie published, and really kind of drive and morph the moment into what we as readers want, because it is as evident as ever that the market and publishing is really going to just kind of reflect what they think is going to sell. Unfortunately, like I said, there should have been the easy sell of historical romance in the wake of Bridgerton. And I don't fully know what the disconnect there is as someone who has been reading romance and historical romance for so long and who talks about Bridgerton here on this channel. And I do wonder, because I've had conversations as well in relation to seeing some classics kind of take a Bridgerton approach in terms of its adaptation or their adaptation in recent years, but not seeing a whole lot of other historical romance series translated to the screen, and how some of that may or may not be traced back to this kind of air of legitimacy, and whether there is still this stigma around romance and what historical romance is that has been somewhat legitimized by Shondaland. However, I think that there are a lot of really voracious and passionate historical romance readers, some fans of Bridgerton, some not, that would tell you why they love the genre so much at the drop of a hat. And if you would like to chime in below, I would love to hear what draws you to historical romance as a historical romance reader. I have personally reached out to the very scientific study sample size of my romance book club to see what they have to say, and if we get any responses or I get any responses, I will insert them here. But this is a book club that actually came to be after Bridgerton and opened up a door for me to kind of coerce a lot of my friends into reading romance, combined with the efforts of a friend who is always up to start a book club. And we put together this group of women that get together and talk about romance. And I am personally very lucky in terms of my own romantic preferences, in that we tend to lean toward historical romance. We've read across, romance, but we keep going back and go back to historical romance. And there is just something so satisfying in it to us. And being able to talk about these books so enthusiastically with my friends is just an honor and a delight. We have gone to Printers Row together and saw Sarah MacLean and Adriana Herrera speak at Printers Row, two of our favorite historical romance authors, and we are eagerly anticipating reading Adriana Herrera's new book in February for book club. And I've been drawn to historical since I was a teen, yes, for the historical escape of it, the kind of grand backgrounds, but also for its interaction and the conversations it can have with the modern moment, returning to that idea of romance speaking to the moment we're in. And I think part of my early entry into this was through time travel romance, where I could more kind of visibly put the mores of today up against the mores of the past and see that kind of clash. But through the lens of historical romance, I'm reminded and gifted these strong women throughout that persevere and find their happily ever afters amidst systems that often aren't working in their favor, and the radical joy of finding that happily ever after amidst everything, and also the promise of the happily ever after amidst some of these more complicated historical moments, and both the personal and the political of it all. And sure, things become more complicated within the historical context and looking at the imperfect past, but also we are in a very imperfect present. And I do think we're going to see a shifting, and we have already started to see a shift in some of the conversations in historical romance. 10 years ago, I was reading these books about the past with very enshrined rights that are no longer enshrined, and it brings me closer to that past than I thought I was. And so the kind of mutability of time and progress is something I think that these books are in conversation with. And of course, that joy that we find amidst everything. And yes, there is something escapist to it. And I think the escapism of knowing the history, having that context, and still, like I said, finding that happily ever after, it's powerful. There are some less profound observations I could bring in from Romance Book Club, but what happens at book club stays at book club. Let's just say we very much enjoyed a pool scene in Sarah MacLean's Never Judge a Lady by Her Cover. Also, just as a personal anecdote, the joy of like watching other people explore these and discover these books like Never Judge a Lady by Her Cover. When we went to Printers Row years ago, we had just read the first of that series. And I remember mentioning to Sarah how excited I was for the rest of book club to get to that book. It obviously, we took some detours, but we got there because we love this series. And I was like, I'm so excited for them to get to the reveal. And she was like, oh, that's not a reveal anymore. Like, that's well known. And I was like, for these readers, it's not. And I think that it's so easy to kind of pigeonhole ourselves into the circles we run in and forget that there are still so many readers that have not yet discovered this wonder of this world. And there are still so many readers, even within these circles, celebrating these worlds and these works. We've got Instagrammers, TikTokers, booktubers dedicated to celebrating and reading historical romance. And so this is still a vibrant, thriving subgenre and community. It's just, like I said, at a moment or the precipice of something, and it's up to us to decide what that something is. But these books are fun and quippy and flirty and a lot hotter than I think that they get credit for sometimes. That carriage scene in season 3 did not come from nowhere. And in fact, carriage scenes are a much beloved genre in historical romance. And I know there are creators that have lists of the best carriage scenes. Sadly, I am not one of them, but I will work to rectify that for you someday. I will start keeping a list of the best carriage scenes I encounter in historicals. This is a genre of sweeping escape into ballrooms, medieval castles, the Paris underground, even the Wild West that Beverly Jenkins can make me care about. It allows us to explore the current moment and reminds us of the past, and I am excited to experience all the new times and places we are going to get to explore as historical romance continues to evolve. And with that, I know that there is so much more to this. There's so much more nuance. There's so much more that we could continue to pick apart and analyze and engage with. But I think that's enough for now, and we can always revisit if we need to. So let me know what you're thinking about all of this, where you are kind of seeing historical romance in the current moment, what you want of historical romance, what you love about historical romance, or just whatever thought maybe came to your mind throughout this discussion, or a counterpoint you would like to bring up. But I very much appreciate you being interested in what I have to say, hanging out, engaging with this discussion. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good, maybe a historical romance, and yeah, bye.